My guest this evening for concert night with the Dayton Philharmonic is our piano soloist, and I should say heroic piano soloist in this program devoted to music of Brahms, Antonio Pompa-Baldi. Heroic because he plays not only a Brahms concerto, but also some Brahms chamber music, and probably if I asked him, he would have played even more Brahms. uh, Antonio, welcome to the program. It's so nice to catch up with you again.
Thank you so much, Neal, for having me. And yes, I would definitely have gone for more Brahms if possible.
So let me start with the question that I ask almost everybody, which is, can you tell us a little bit about how your life has been this past almost year now, dealing with COVID, and what music making and what teaching has been like, and just how you've been?
Sure. Well, I have to start by saying that I would be remiss if I didn't say that I feel lucky. Because in the midst of all this suffering and this situation, this sense of loss and tragedy and the difficulties for many, many people, I've been lucky because, both my wife and I and our daughter are in good health and we have our jobs. So we are, of course, we miss the stage, we miss performing for large audiences, and we cannot wait to return to that. Um, but I've also been extremely productive with my studying, learning, and music making. I've been recording. I've taught myself how to video record and edit. So I've recorded solo recitals. I've recorded four-hand piano recitals with my wife. I've made large-scale piano arrangements of pieces such as the Respighi Violin Sonata, for example. I have commissioned pieces. I have recorded them. One of these recordings has been released on February 5th, and it's a world premiere recording of two large-scale operatic paraphrases for piano that I commissioned from Italian composer Roberto Piana on the two beloved operas Puccini's La Bohème and Bizet's Carmen. And so that was a very fun project among many. So I cannot complain, but obviously I look forward to going back on tour and performing for live audiences again. And the teaching has been all online, of course.
And your students have been doing all right with the online teaching and
Well, I
just
have to
the
say,
distance?
when this first happened, the schools closed and all the students were basically sent home. So all lessons shifted to online. Some students were a little bit more better equipped for this because they had a better internet or good instruments at home and good equipment to broadcast or stream their playing. Very few of them had a little bit more difficulty, but the key word was patience. But I think that once you shift to that format, if you have good internet, good Wi-Fi, and a good simple USB microphone like the one I'm using now, anything that is a little bit better than the built-in microphones of a computer or a phone, then I think that there are good things that can still be achieved by having online lessons, and it definitely beats having no lessons at all by a lot. Um, yeah, the school then returned to partly in-person lessons for those students who wanted to have one-on-one lessons in person. So I've started teaching again, going to CIM, the Cleveland Institute of Music. But about half or more of my students are home, and a lot of them are in China or in Asia. So I'm teaching at very strange, weird times because I don't want the students to be up in the middle of the night, and also they would have good fights with their neighbors if that were the case.
Yes.
Because most of them live in apartments, as you know, it's different than here. It's more similar to my European, Italian upbringing, where we all lived in apartments and had to deal with, times that we were allowed to play.
I
Um,
remember when I was a student in Paris, it was a similar situation. I was
yeah,
I was in this tiny apartment that was mostly taken up by an upright piano, and there were just very, very strict rules that you couldn't play until I think it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and you
correct.
couldn't play after 6 o'clock at night. So I usually I usually started at 10 in the morning and finished by 5
Just to avoid any
to relieve.
problems. Yeah.
Um,
In
and
Italy,
and
you
it,
had to deal with in Italy you had to deal with the afternoon nap as well.
oh, right.
The siesta.
Absolutely. So that brings back memories. So say you have a student who's in Beijing, for instance. What time would you be up in the middle of the night for their lesson?
No, I mean, I try to concentrate the lessons of people who are in Asia very, very early in the morning. Like I could start at 6 a.m. here.
Uh,
And so for them, it would be 7 in the
7 in
evening.
the evening. That's right. That's
Uh,
right. So it's not that bad.
no, but I would do like 2 or 3 students at that hour until roughly 10 p.m. in China. Past that, they cannot play. And then I would teach some more Asian students in my late evening. So let's say 9, 10, 11 p.m. here, so that it would be morning
Morning for
for
them.
them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's
And I
pretty.
think and I think perhaps as a piano teacher, well, maybe in music, any one-on-one teaching situation, I can see how it could adapt fairly well to the Zoom environment. It's only if you're trying to coach a string quartet or something like that, it becomes really, really difficult.
It is more difficult, although I did coach the Schumann String Quartet online a couple of times this past semester, but with excellent, excellent equipment that was in-house at the school with giant screen and excellent microphones. So, and a very, very fast internet connection. So in that case, it's still possible. Also very skilled student artists, I should say,
Yes.
which, allows you to talk about very lofty concepts and things that don't suffer from this format of not being in presence. But yeah, of course, as I always say, I've been very pleased with what the internet has allowed us to do, and especially once you navigate it a little bit and know a little bit better how to adapt. But nothing beats playing live, nothing beats being in the same room when you coach somebody, when you talk about music and exemplify or demonstrate. You cannot really approximate that close enough.
Really, it's absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about Brahms and about our collaboration back in May of 2016. So to give a little bit of background, and I don't know if you know this or not, if I've told you the full story, um, but what we asked you to do was something not quite superhero, but close. We had two concerts that we performed on two successive nights. Each concert began with one of the two Brahms overtures. Each concert ended with one of the two Brahms piano concertos. And in between, you played a piece of chamber music by Brahms. The first night was a piano trio, and the second night was a violin sonata. So it was really a kind of piano marathon for you. So the first time we did this, the idea came from pianist Janina Filkowska, and she basically thought it up. We were trying to figure out a way that we could build a weekend around the two Chopin piano concertos. And she came up with this just wonderful idea of an evening devoted to Chopin and his circle. So the first night began with, I don't remember what it was. It was a Berlioz overture,
Uh-huh.
and then she did a mini piano recital of Chopin and Schumann, I think it was. And then the second night we started with Liszt's Les Préludes with the orchestra, and then she gave a recital of Chopin and Mendelssohn,
Mm-hmm.
and then the concertos on the second half. And
Wonderful.
then we did that model again a few years later with Norman Krieger as the pianist, focused on Beethoven. And then the third time we did it was with you. So
I see.
it's a wonderful idea, but you have to have a pianist like you and like Norman and like Janina who is willing to make their fingers do a lot of work.
Oh, no, listen, I mean, from my perspective, I can only tell you this. When I've been asked by you to do this, I looked at it as the only possible way I could look at it, a gift.
Mm,
And when I was asked to play 5 Beethoven concertos in 3 days, consecutive days, I looked at it as a gift. When I played the 5 Rachmaninoff piano and orchestra pieces in Cape Town, the same way. So these are gifts that unfortunately don't come by very often. And so I jumped at the opportunity. Well, as you said, and it really is true. I would have played even more with all the great music that Brahms wrote for chamber music. You know, we could have gone on for weeks doing just
Absolutely.
Brahms.
Do you, if you're doing a performance like that, or like you say, the five Beethoven concertos in 3 days, do you do you prepare for it any differently than you would for a performance where you were only doing one concerto or a traditional piano recital?
Well, I guess the most obvious thing that differs is the amount of music you have to have ready. So you have to really devote more time to preparing. You have to perhaps start a little bit in advance, but it also depends. Are these pieces that you've played a lot or not? Or are all of them in your fingers or some of them completely new? So there is a lot of variables there, but let's say that these are all, like in the case of the Beethoven concerto, or even the Liszt concertos number 1, 2, and Totentanz, which I played in the same evening, or Rachmaninoff, which is a lot of notes. I had played all of them before. And so it was just a matter of giving myself ample time to be ready for the performance, which again is a present because you get to spend a lot of time with music that you love deeply. And so it doesn't certainly feel like work, but you do have to put in some extra work.
Well, let's talk a little bit about these two amazing piano concertos by
Sure.
Brahms. Very different in character, but just absolutely wonderful, wonderful pieces. So,
Yeah.
can you give us some of your thoughts about the first Brahms concerto and what it means to you, and maybe if you have any personal connections or teachers you studied it with, or what your personal story of this concerto is.
Well, I don't know if my personal relationship with the piece is as interesting as the story of the piece itself and how it came to be.
That's true.
Um,
It is an amazing
because it
story.
reads like a novel. But what I can say is that my personal impressions from the piece, from the very first time that I heard it, which was, by the way, a performance of Rubinstein, and this was a recording, one of those vinyl CDs. That left a very, very lasting impression, and it had an immediate effect of leaving me like shocked. And I didn't know why, and I would not have been able to explain why. But obviously, now we know. I mean, the beginning of the concerto is almost scary in its anguish and the tragedy and instability, even. There is no way to latch onto much at the beginning because it keeps moving, it keeps shifting. Um, Knowing what I came to know later, I mean, I understand it better, and I also understand how, um, and I'm amazed at how Brahms conceived it only days after his friend Schumann tried to kill himself. And he was in the beginning of a deep friendship with him and his wife, Clara, who he then ended up falling desperately in love with. And all of this went into this music. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about the music history side because people can read that on their own, and it's worth doing if they don't know. But what is most incredible to me is that basically you have a 20-year-old who is such a genius that God gave him so much talent, but he didn't have the technical tools. He didn't know how to handle the inspirations that were coming to him, this material, this massive amount of material that was coming to him. He didn't know what to do with it, didn't know how to deal with it. And he ended up starting to write a two-piano sonata. And then that wasn't enough, and he wanted to express more. And then so he turned it into a symphony, but then he didn't know how to write for orchestra and felt completely lost in spite of the help of his more experienced friends, although perhaps less talented, I should say, Joseph Joachim and Julius Grimm. And then that was not good enough. He dreamt, I read somewhere that he dreamt of playing that piece, which at the time was still a symphony, as a piano concerto. So in his dream, he was performing it as a piano concerto. And that's when he started thinking about turning it into one. And it took him 4 years or more until he could finally play it, or they finished it and could play it. And as if that was not enough, he deleted completely the second and third movement and started writing them anew. And the second movement became a musical portrait, a tender portrait, he called it, of Clara Schumann, and who in the meantime had become a widowed, a widow, and with whom Brahms was still desperately in love. And the third movement gave him the most massive creative block that every artist can fear. Didn't know what to do with the last movement, and he ended up basically mirroring the last movement on the last movement of Beethoven's third piano concerto.
Absolutely.
Although it cannot really be said that he stole anything, because the material is completely and entirely his own, and the style is his own, and the language you hear clearly as Brahmsian. But if you analyze the composition and its form, you can see that it's almost a carbon copy. So the gestation of it was so incredibly difficult. And you can hear all of this anguish, this tragedy, this sense of loss, this yearning in the music. It makes, especially notably, the first movement. Well, I felt all of that, but I could not have possibly expressed it when I first heard the music, because, you know, you're baffled because it is presented in such a classical way in its frame. But then nothing inside it is predictable, and it all keeps shifting. And also, when you're not aware of the subtle transformations of the melodic material, you feel like there's something connecting the whole thing together. You cannot even point your finger at what it is. And then you only, when you have the tools to analyze it, understand it a little bit better, then you find your bearings. And finally, the melodic materials in this concerto, in the first movement alone, there is 6 main themes rather than the usual 2 that you get. And some of them are only very covertly connected. So you cannot at first really understand which way they connect to one another. But it is an amazing piece. And to think that it all came to a person who was only 20 years old, and well, 24, 25 when it was finished.
Yeah, I agree. It's so interesting. You know, there's the story behind this piece and the story behind the First Symphony, which are kind of interconnected. And a similar issue of how do you create this thing that you have in your mind? And I find it so fascinating that Brahms had such trouble creating these large pieces when ultimately, once he went through the process, he really mastered the ability to create these very long musical forms. But it's interesting to think of him struggling, because when you look at his career from the end backwards, it's hard to conceive that someone who wrote the pieces that he did ever had any trouble at all.
Though it should be noted that he waited about 15 years before he attempted anything like the concerto again. I think it scarred him, because he writes extensively in his letters about his own inabilities. And, you know, he even sends the material to a friend and he says, "Don't ask me about the orchestration. I don't even understand it. Most of it is Joachim's anyway." It's like, I mean, he was very humble. You can surmise that from all of his writings. So he probably was exaggerating, and he was also self-deprecating in his sense of humor. And this is true also in his second piano concerto, as we will see. But yeah, it is true though that he was scarred by this difficult process, and did not even try for another 15, 20 years.
So the second concerto,
Yeah.
so much later, from the very, I mean, if you think of, well, you know, that's not fair because every composer is different, but you know, you think of the way the first piano concerto begins with this long Beethoven style Ninth Symphony kind of oration by the orchestra. And then you compare it to the second piano concerto, which is so relaxed, and it has a smile on its face from the very beginning. It's almost hard in the first moment to imagine the same person wrote the 2 pieces. But of course, as soon as you start turning the pages, you realize, yes, it's exactly the same person.
Absolutely. Well, the one thing that the two concertos are very, very different, obviously, as you pointed out, and they were written about 25 years apart. Um, but I think that, and this is definitely the work of a masterful composer, somebody who had really mastered this art form. It is more transcendent, I think, more philosophical for sure. Obviously, the years of maturity. It's almost as if he had metabolized all of this tragedy, this anguish, the brooding, the insecurities, the yearning, even the sense of loss for this impossible love, and the despair of his youthful years. But I view this piece personally, this in a similar way, although it's a much more massive scale than his solo piano pieces of the maturity. I view this as a reflection of the different stages of his own life and of life in general, from the perspective of older age. So it's almost as if he's reflecting on his own life. In fact, yes, it opens up with this serene outlook. But then, even in the course of the first movement, you have a succession of more almost quasi-heroic moments and more dramatic moments. But you can tell that it's been viewed from a distance, not from inside of it, not from the middle of it. He looks back at his youth, his passionate perorations and the heroism of the second movement in particular. Then you have the lyricism, almost like spirituality of the third, almost like an acceptance of the passing of life and the coming of old age. And then finally, this acceptance leads to a serenity, almost a playfulness in the last movement, where the artist can afford being not childish, but childlike, still keeping a twinkle in his eye. And I think, we know now that this was not quite the end of his life, of course. He still had about 15 more years of living and composing. He would turn darker, I think, later on in his life. And we will see a little bit of that with the chamber music that we will talk about. But at this point, I think the photograph at that point in life, I think what I just said photographs well what he was going through and what went through the process of writing this concerto. He was at this time, of course, very successful as a composer, because we should also point out a couple more things. By way of an analogy, the two pieces share this, I would say, being less traditional, a solo concerto, and more of a symphony with piano obbligato. And some people would say this is true more of the second concerto than the first. And in a way, that's true. But I also think it's true of the first, like you pointed out, this large opening for the orchestra that makes you think of a symphony, Beethoven's in particular, but also the fact that in a stunning reversal of what was customary practice, most of the soft playing is given to the piano in the first piano concerto, and most of the massive playing is given to the orchestra. And also there is no cadenza in either concertos. Well, there is smaller cadenzas in the second and third movement, but not the traditional large cadenza given the soloist in the first movements. This is missing, perhaps in a sort of a continuation of a tradition established by the Emperor Concerto of Beethoven. But so there is these analogies, but there's also the differences. All of it seems to unfold more naturally, more organically in the second piano concerto, and it's funny how the massive proportions he talks about so humorously in a letter to his friend Elisabeth von Herzogenberg. He does say this: "I don't mind telling you that I have written a tiny, tiny piano concerto with a tiny, teensy, tiny wisp of a scherzo."
Right.
The gigantic scherzo is probably one movement that he had deleted from the violin concerto. I'm not sure. I didn't find any conclusive evidence of this, but it's possible. And so the violin concerto ended up being in 3, not 4 movements, and of course the second piano concerto is in 4 movements. And by that time, another thing to notice is that he had become a very close friend with Hans von Bülow, who basically You know, Brahms struggled to premiere his first piano concerto, struggled to, because he was still an unknown entity, and he was, you know, the public met the first piano concerto with such a fiasco and a debacle. And the second piano concerto met with rapturous approval everywhere. So he had the luxury of being able to have his own orchestra in the Meiningen orchestra of Hans von Bülow, which basically was at his disposal for anything he wanted to try out. And then it was premiered in Budapest. The first piano concerto was supposed to be premiered in his own hometown of Hamburg, and nobody would even want to do it. And when he finally was able to schedule it, there was only apparently one decent piano in town, and the owner of this piano denied him this piano. So he basically gave up and decided not to have it premiered over there. And it was first, I think, a public rehearsal rather than a premiere was given in Hanover. And then there was a debacle in Leipzig. And then it was only at the third or fourth attempt that they went back to Hamburg and were able to play it to a mild reception. So that the way the concerto met with the audience, the results were very negative, I would say, and even that, you know, was something that Brahms suffered through, and probably made him wait so long before he tried something like that again. But by the time the second piano concerto came about, he was already hailed as the greatest composer, at least in one camp, because by then he was in a basically, if not he himself, I mean, there were two big factions in Germany, the Wagner and Liszt on one side, and Brahms, Schumann, Brahms on the other, and Hans von Bülow was the one that was caught in the middle.
Right, because he worked with all of them.
Well, he was Franz Liszt's son-in-law, and you know, then he became a champion of Brahms. But he himself said, you know, I wasted 3/4 of my career in the crazy camp, and only now I'm enjoying myself. Well, I think that was a little bit of an exaggeration, but you know, he definitely switched allegiances, I think. Liszt himself was ambivalent. He was polite to Brahms through the end of his life, even praising the second concerto, though mildly, in a postcard I think he wrote to Brahms, saying that he didn't understand it at first, but then came to appreciate it. He wasn't gushing over the concerto, of course, but that was a lot coming from Liszt, and especially after, for many years, the two factions had been so divided, and exponents of each had been so vocally violent or almost virulent against one another.
I think it's always, I've always found it interesting because I mean, Brahms, for many years I've always loved Brahms's music, but at one point some time ago, you know, we always get these questions, who is your favorite composer? And
Yeah.
I decided at one point, shortly after I moved to Dayton, that I should give people an answer. I shouldn't say, you know, whichever composer I was playing at the moment.
Yeah.
And I thought about it, and I thought, no, it's Brahms. Brahms is really my favorite. But Wagner is another composer that I like, and I had done a lot of analytical work on pieces of Wagner in my academic wanderings. But one of the things that always struck me is how the war between the two camps really did not involve either of the two composers.
Yeah. Yeah,
It was Brahmsians using Brahms to beat Wagner over the head,
yeah.
and Wagnerians using Wagner to beat Brahms over the head.
And
But
one of the biggest Wagnerian followers who beat Brahms over the head was the philosopher Nietzsche.
yes, exactly.
My God, if you read what he wrote about Brahms, I mean, if I had been Brahms, I probably would have wanted to disappear. But Brahms didn't seem to care much at all.
And one of the things that, I mean, I won't use this in the radio broadcast because it's way too technical, but I think when you look at particularly a lot of some of Brahms's later music, he uses
Yeah.
some of the very same methods that Wagner used in order to create these large structures of music. He just used his own musical language and not
Absolutely.
Wagner's. And
Absolutely.
that always struck me as, I'm sure he must have heard some of Wagner's music.
Yeah.
And, he was, Brahms was in some ways the first musicologist because he knew Bach and he knew Palestrina and he knew all, and he used all
Absolutely.
those things.
Absolutely.
And I like to imagine Brahms, opening up the score to something by Wagner and looking at it and saying, "Oh, yeah,
I'm sure that
I could do that too,
happened.
in
Well,
my own way."
yeah, no, I think that one of the striking differences between Brahms and Wagner, in my opinion, aside from the technical side, is that one was centered on himself. And
Indeed.
probably you can say that Wagner was more of a dictatorial character, whereas Brahms was a true democratic character. He was much more humble. He really wanted to please even the middle class listener, even though, I mean, he didn't have to, but he wanted and sought approval from even the amateurs. That's why for many years he wrote these music, even though they're not hack jobs by any means. But he wrote these, for example, piano duets and other material that people could play in their own homes, and chamber music as well to a certain extent, um, to be really the people's composer. And I always loved this about him.
And there was also that sense of generosity
Yeah.
that he showed toward Schumann and other composers. And of course, Wagner had no generosity towards anyone.
No, Wagner received a lot, but didn't ever give back, like
Right,
from Liszt, for example, and others. Brahms, it was a two-way street for sure.
exactly. One of the more interesting things that I stumbled on back again in my academic career was had to do with Wagner, because this, if I had ever written it, this is what my master's thesis was going to be on, which was the Wagner Faust Overture,
Mm,
which is a piece he wrote in 1840,
very.
kind of he was in Paris at the time and had seen the Conservatory Orchestra rehearse the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth and was just blown away by how good the orchestra was and the piece, of course. And he basically wrote this D minor Faust overture. And Liszt somehow got found out about it and liked it and conducted it, and then wrote this detailed letter back to Wagner telling him everything that was wrong with it.
Yeah.
And they had this amazing correspondence back and forth about Liszt detailing all the flaws in the piece and Wagner defending them. And the funny thing about it was that Liszt's big thing was that there wasn't enough Gretchen in it. It was all just Faust. There was no feminine aspect to it. And Wagner's answer, which I'm convinced was just an out and out lie, just to, make an excuse, he said, "Well, yes, you're right, but really what I was going to do, it was going to be the first movement of a Faust symphony. And the
Ah,
first movement would be Faust alone in his study, and the second movement would be Gretchen, and the third movement would be Mephistopheles, but I decided not to finish it." And of course, that's the symphony that
and
Liszt
Liszt
then
wrote,
went ahead and
of course.
wrote.
Well, Liszt was fascinated by that story anyway, because it's also, you can say it's the libretto, if there was one, to his massive piano sonata.
Right.
And it's also, he wrote paraphrases on Gounod's Faust as well. It's a subject that he treated many times, whether overtly or not so much, but it's something that occupied him for a long time. That's probably why he was so passionate in criticizing Wagner. And I'm sure that, knowing what I know about Liszt and all that I've read, it was constructive criticism,
Yes. Right.
not offered in a malicious way, or to put down, but to
Yeah.
genuinely for caring,
It
because
it
that's how Liszt
absolutely
was.
was.
Yeah.
And then 15 years later, I think after Liszt had written the Faust Symphony, Wagner asked Liszt to send him the score back because he wanted to revise it. And that's when he did the second version of the symphony, which of the overture, which when it ever gets played is the one that that still is played.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to just be reading these letters, and these two tremendous composers and giant egos kind of both
Sparring, yeah.
sparring, but also having a substantive composer to composer discussion.
Yeah.
And then of course he ends up being Wagner's father-in-law.
Of course, yeah. And then he was so disappointed at his daughter Cosima when she left Hans von Bülow to go
Right.
to Wagner. And so that also, drove a little bit of a wedge into their relationship. But Liszt could not hold a grudge, incredibly enough. I mean, he continued to champion Wagner and never spoke ill, at least in any documents that we have, about Wagner until the end of his life. Until the end of Wagner's life, which came first, of course. But anyway.
So we should talk a little bit. I mean, obviously, I'm a conductor. I work with orchestras, so for me, Brahms is about the orchestral pieces. But one of the wonderful things about these programs that you did with us was the fact that we also had some chamber music on each program, a piano trio and a violin sonata. So can you tell us a little bit about Brahms, the chamber musician, and that aspect of his music making?
Absolutely. Well, for these concerts, I suggested and was glad to be able to play pieces of Brahms's maturity, actually really late pieces, both the violin sonata the third violin sonata in D minor, opus 108, and the piano trio in C minor, opus 101. They were at least begun in the same time frame in the summer of 1886, when Brahms was in Switzerland vacationing. He had taken to composing basically in the summer months while he was passing the waters, as they used to say. They have something in common. They are, especially the violin sonata is rather pessimistic and brooding for large moments. But I don't mean to say that the lyrical side is missing, because it's not. But it is definitely darker. The music is darker. It's almost as if what we talked about in the second piano concerto, the serenity of the old age coming, and the a little bit more detached view of things, is no longer there. We've gone beyond that, and there is almost like a sense of impending doom at times. And well, the violin sonata certainly opens with inner agitation, that restlessness, dictated by all these syncopations, and it is very passionate, but still, as I said, very, very dark. It's in 4 movements, unlike the other violin sonatas, and he was, he was working at the same time on a set of Lieder, the Opus 105, which I think, while not directly related, give us an idea of what was on his mind, I think, because the texts of these Lieder, Opus 105, they talk about death, they talk about graveyards, they talk about murder, they talk about betrayal. Those are the subjects. And contemporarily, he was writing this violin sonata, and at the same time, he also started the third piano trio in C minor. Although he finished that a couple of years later. But I noticed the same thing even in the latter solo piano pieces, for example, the Opus 118, which end in such a grim, dark manner. It's really almost like they dissolve into nothingness. He has the technical mastery at this point to do whatever he wants and to express whatever he wants as a composer. And so the tools that he uses are allowing him to express this gray and then ever growing darker feeling very clearly. um, and he almost like anticipates the I would say expressionism. Like some theorized that he was a direct link to Schoenberg himself, and Schoenberg himself wrote about Brahms. But the latter pieces really exemplify this. As Adorno said, expressionism is the truthfulness of the subjective feeling without any illusions, disguises, euphemisms, and this is really bare bone music that he was going towards, but not quite in these two chamber music pieces. But there is some of that already. The violin sonata is dedicated to Hans von Bülow. Again, we have this friend and champion of Brahms's music. And Bülow was a passionate individual, so I think in some way maybe the music reflects this. And the first movement, as I said, is completely unsettling with all these syncopated rhythms, but it has lyrical moments of great beauty. The second movement, the violin takes over and becomes the center stage, and the piano purely accompanies it. The third movement is the opposite. This time the piano leads and the violin has only accompanimental figurations. And the last movement is the most passionate, almost like frenzied, virtuosic, concluding with a thunderous passage work. The trio is extremely innovative in its meter, especially. There is almost no sense of a beat in the first movement. And it continues to shift and to be very ambiguous in that sense. And in the third movement, we have extraordinary time signatures. Like there is a time where we have a 3/4 plus 2/4 plus 2/4. It creates really a sense of a 7-beat phrase. And then later on you have 9/4 plus 6/8, which equals a 5-beat phrase or pattern. And then the last movement starts on an upbeat, which sounds like a downbeat. So it's really very ambiguous. And hemiolas become, which have always been very omnipresent in Brahms, but here become literally omnipresent. They're everywhere. So it's very interesting, the direction that he's taking. And also, what I could say in conclusion is that Brahms was always accused almost, or praised in some camps, for being more conservative. And however, he was a revolutionary in his own way. As a matter of fact, I was talking about Schoenberg before, and Schoenberg himself called Brahms a progressive composer. Mm-hmm. And the piano trio in C minor is a perfect example of this, because the pulse basically is obscured. There is very little sense of a structure, even though the frame seems to be clear, but inside of it, nothing is clear at all. And then I'm reminded of what Schoenberg wrote. He said that the real and lasting popularity is attained only in those very rare circumstances where there is power of expression granted to people who dwell intensely on the sphere of basic human sentiments, I think he put it. And so basically, Brahms achieves lasting impact and immortality with audiences during his day and during the rest of eternity, basically, because he's the voice of history. He continues to speak to audiences today the same way as he did then, and the same way he will hundreds of years from now, I think, because of this. So he is really atemporal, but he is a progressive nonetheless. His music speaks to different eras in different ways because he keeps being relevant.
And it's interesting, you were talking about how these late pieces of Brahms kind of begin to connect with the newer trends in aesthetics. And I remember when I was, years ago, when I was in Paris, studying with Nadia Boulanger, one of the things she always used to love to say was that there were only a couple of years, I think it's 3 years, maybe 4 at most, between Brahms's clarinet quintet and Debussy's Prelude to Afternoon of a Faun.
Absolutely.
That they were almost in the same world. And it's at first it seems impossible that those two pieces of music could have been in the same time, But then when you look at Brahms, especially late in his life, he is, he's breathing the same air that Debussy was breathing. He's just breathing it into a slightly different body and a different worldview. But
Absolutely.
but you can see that the changes in musical history and in European culture still reflected in his music. He's not stuck in the
Not at all.
Beethoven era the way he's caricatured.
No, and the last few pieces are really futuristic, I
Mhm.
would say, um, and they really do um, almost without uh, any interruption lead to the second school of Vienna. Uh, the early stages of it, of course, and particularly the early Schoenberg. I mean, if you hear, we call early Schoenberg, you can call early Schoenberg a romantic composer.
Absolutely.
The same way you can call Brahms a post-romantic composer, but with classical roots. But again, I think the greatness of his trajectory as a composer is that he started where he started, took what was left to him and evolved and brought it forward without necessarily renege on anything, and kept transforming and evolving, and then left it for its natural continuation of progression to a Schoenberg.
Right. So
That
he's
then
he becomes almost the bridge between Beethoven and Schoenberg, or
I
the
think
bridge
so.
the bridge between the early 19th century and the early 20th century.
I
He's
do believe so. I
he's
do
the
believe
person
so.
who takes music from one era to the next.
I do believe so.
And then of course there's the beautiful, if at least to me, way that Brahms and Schoenberg come together in Schoenberg's
The quart-
orchestration of the piano quartet, which
quartet,
is
of course.
one of my favorite pieces. And for me it's the fifth Brahms symphony. And it
Absolutely.
has that crazy cymbal crash and the xylophone, which is, well, maybe not. But it's a wonderful, I mean, it works. And it
It's perfect, and it deserves the recognition that it finally got.
yeah. Well, Antonio, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Uh, Almost as much of a pleasure as conducting for you. And I hope that sometime soon in the future we'll be able to do that again, and not just talk but play also.
I totally second that. I hope that we get to make music together soon and we overcome this pandemic and that it gets eradicated as soon as possible. And I want to thank you again, even though it's been almost 5 years ago now, for giving me this beautiful present, inviting me to play this gorgeous music with you and with the wonderful musicians of the Dayton Philharmonic. Thank you so much, Neal.
Oh, thank you. And of course, thanks to the magic of radio, we get to relive it now and get nostalgic about 5 years ago.